If you're a member of the media or want to be and wish to cover the PGA Tour's marquee events, the Players, the President's Cup, the FedEx Cup playoffs, my guest on this episode is the gatekeeper. Tracey Veal is the manager of media relations for the PGA Tour, a position with a wide range of responsibilities, from credentialing to training to logistics like parking and seating. Tracey's purview goes way beyond the typical boundaries of public relations. In our conversation, we discuss the many hats she wears and how the very definition of media is changing, plus how her unique prior experience contributes to her role as one who serves the golf media, the PGA Tour, and its players. My name is Whit Watson, and this is Media Credentials. I'm a sports announcer who's worked a lot of places. This podcast will peel back the layers of sports media and show you how the sausage gets made. Through interviews with industry pros and my own experience, you'll understand why you're seeing what you're seeing and who's responsible for it. Your media credentials have been approved. When I started the podcast, the first challenge was picking out a name. As I mentioned in the very first episode called Hi Hello, that's kind of a big deal. You have to make sure the name is available, and the experts say you should choose something that gives potential listeners at least a hint about your topic. I settled on Media Credentials, which gives me some leeway in terms of guests and topics. The second challenge is to create cover art, a logo for the podcast. Once that was done, I posted the cover art on social media with a note saying, "Coming soon, Media Credentials, a podcast that goes behind the scenes in sports media." Among the responses I got was one from a woman named Tracey Veal. She reposted the cover art on Twitter with a one-word caption, "Interested." I thought, well, that was nice. So I looked at her profile and found out she was the manager of media relations for the PGA Tour. So I sent her a message and said, "You're the perfect guest." She agreed to come on, and you'll be glad she did. An interesting backstory that brought her to her current role, where she serves multiple constituencies. It's a job likely more complex than you think, as you're about to hear. If you're going to start a podcast and call it Media Credentials, there's no better person to speak to than my guest, Tracey Veal, the manager of media relations for the PGA Tour. An enormous job, apparently. How did you get started in what you're doing now?
Well, thanks, Whit, for having me on. And I did love the name of your podcast. When I saw it, it just captured my attention because this really is kind of a niche job in the area of public relations. There are so many other things that people do that are more aligned with traditional roles, such as yourself in broadcasting. How I got started was I took the road less traveled. I retired from the Coast Guard after 22 years, and I was looking to step away from government and to experience like corporate America, a whole different area for me because I joined the Coast Guard at such a young age. That was literally, my whole formative years working in that type of an environment. I was drawn to the PGA Tour because it was a prominent organization within the community that I already lived, and I didn't want to relocate, had a solid reputation. Honestly, I didn't really follow the sport. I knew of golf, and I took a PE credit in college, golf, but not really played on a golf team or even really watched a whole lot of golf. So I didn't know back then that our tournaments were set up as nonprofits and the charitable giving, which later I learned to really love and embrace about the organization. So I threw my hat in the ring and decided to apply for a position. There was an executive assistant to the head of communications open. This was back in 2005. And I got the job. It was a great position to learn so much about what was happening at the highest levels of the organization. Executive assistants were a really tight-knit group. We had like best practices meetings, and we often leaned on each other because our bosses worked together. And so I learned how the organization was set up and who to go to for what. And it's funny because all these years later, I'm in a completely different role. I still have people reach out to me and say, you may not be the right person to answer this question, but I know you'll know who handles it. So I get a kick out of that has stayed with me all these years. Those early years at the tour, our communications department was much smaller than it is today, which really provided an opportunity to have my hands in more processes. We have so many more experts today at what they do. It's not really the same situation. So I took advantage of that. We didn't have the kind of automation and technology also that exists today. So like press releases, for instance, were sent via email instead of with the PR tools that we have today, where we can schedule a release and do it at different times and have all these lists that are already built into the system. So literally, we would have the Barron's books with everybody at every newspaper throughout the country and TV station, and we would manually put these lists together and keep them updated. And that's how I kind of learned who the media were. I recall sending a press release announcing our television deal using WordPro. That's how kind of back and out of date we were. Editing that document about 100 times because the networks all had to look at it. Our executives all had to look at it. So before everybody was happy, I had my hands on that document quite a bit. And then we started getting up to date because it was like, look, next time we're doing this, we're not using this tool that everybody doesn't have. So, I think the young people today that work here would do an eye roll when they learned about some of the processes that we had to deal with back then. But again, some of those things were early opportunities to sort of get into other areas and to learn more. I worked on the rollout of the FedEx Cup playoffs, and that kind of changed how the end of our seasons were with our tournaments. During the Great Recession, I watched when many of the auto dealers who were our title sponsors at the time and needed government relief to stay afloat, they had to end their sponsorships. And watching and observing how our marketing team, filled those title sponsorships. And it just was so impressive to see the people around me and the people that I worked with. I enjoyed that very much about, getting into the PGA Tour in that early season and watching things happening and how things have evolved. Unfortunately, newspapers started reducing staffs, and that was tough watching many of the media that I worked with being laid off. Eventually, many of the golf magazines and newspapers started to reduce some of their print issues and moved in the direction of online circulation. And those challenges ended up moving us forward and streamlining processes to create better product, something that was more easily consumed. And then, of course, social media came around, which took off and opened up a whole new element to media. After a few years as an executive assistant, I was, wanting to learn more about different parts of the tour. And David Pillsbury, who oversaw all the tournament player clubs at the time, he was looking for a new assistant. So he hired me, and I began learning all about the general managers and the clubs and how that whole operation worked. It wasn't long after that when Commissioner Fincham came and asked me to work for him, which I did. Communications at that level was a whole different focus. I got a peek into how his day was organized and the executive team and the title sponsor CEOs, policy board members. It was really impressive seeing how he managed all that. And his memory was unbelievable. I remember taking notes at a meeting, and then he had so many other things that caught his attention. For the next week, we went back to a catch up for that meeting. And I said, would you like to see my notes? And he just kind of chuckled. And I realized that meant I remember all this stuff, even though I've done a million things since then. It was really, like I said, it kind of blew my mind that he would remember all those details of what was talked about a week prior. So that was a really neat experience working for him. But then the person that was managing media relations retired in 2017, and I slid into that role. It was very big shoes to fill. She had actually started working for the tour when the tour was in a couple of duplex houses in Oak Ridge. So the whole facility that exists today wasn't even there. So she had cutting edge of knowing from the very beginning all of that history of how things came to be and how they work. I helped develop the current website that we're using for managing media credentials, and I'm the website administrator for that. My degree is actually in computer network management, which is unlike most of my colleagues who, major in mass communications or marketing or sports management. But I enjoy seeing both sides of it, both the management side, how we manage everything within the computer system, and train all the other media directors that do that job as well. I personally manage media credentials for the media center logistics for 5 or 6 events each year, some of our biggest events, including the Players' Championship, President's Cup, and the FedEx Cup playoffs. And I assist the tournament media directors from the host organizations that run other PGA Tour events.
So I want to get into the meat and potatoes of that role and those responsibilities. But as a purely selfish question, as the only child of 2 service brats, when you told me that you spent 22 years in the Coast Guard, I'm fascinated by that. Why? What drove you to do that before you went out into the corporate world?
So my dad was in the Coast Guard. So I did sort of grow up in that environment where we moved to a new location every few years. He was at sea a lot, so he was gone. And I remember when I was a teenager trying to figure out what it is I wanted to do with my life. And he said, you ought to think about joining the Coast Guard. And of course, being a snotty teenager, I was like, that's for you. That's not for me. I'm going to figure out what I want to do myself.
Right.
Well, it wasn't long working in retail, and I said, take me to the recruiter. I just had that love of adventure and travel that he actually inspired in me by telling me all these stories when I was young. Oh, I was in Antarctica playing with the penguins and, all these great adventures. He had literally sailed all around the world on Coast Guard ships. And I just thought, if nothing else, I'm going to travel and get an education. And so as a person with few resources, he took me to the recruiter. I joined. From boot camp, I was stationed in Air Station Barbers Point, Hawaii, which I'm not going to lie, it was a beautiful station. We were right across from the beach. An opportunity came along and they said, we need someone to stand duty up in the radio room. You have to sleep up here. It's going to be about once every 5 days, but we'll wake you up in the middle of the night if there's a search and rescue case, and you keep the radio guard for the helicopters and aircraft that are out there. And then you send the message traffic about what happened with the case. So I said, yeah, sign me up. That sounds like fun. And so when I started talking to aircraft in the middle of the night, instead of being annoyed that I was woken up, it actually thrilled me. I thought, this is a lot of fun. I want to go to radio school. So that I did. A year later, I went to Petaluma, California, and went to radio school where we learned to copy Morse code. That was something that stumped a lot of people, but you had to copy at least 18 words a minute to graduate. And you learned all kinds of other things, back then, radio teletype and voice communications. And so after school, I went to a communication station in Chesapeake, Virginia. One of the early cases I had, I was just 19 years old at the time. I was standing a mid-watch and I was monitoring the calling in distress frequency, and which was normally boring. You just type in a log, all the things that you hear coming over. And at 2:00 in the morning, I heard an SOS, which I know coming from radio school was very rare. They talked about how, you have to be prepared for it, but very rarely do you hear an SOS. On voice communication distress frequencies, you hear maydays more often from fishing vessels and the like, of people who get in trouble out at sea. But this was an SOS from the vessel called the Marine Electric, which ended up sinking off the coast of Virginia. It was unbelievable to me to be communicating with this person, the radioman on that ship, sending perfect Morse code when here he was, the vessel was sinking and he was in distress. I had people come in and help me, obviously, because it was not something that I should handle on my own. And we all began asking questions back and forth of the radioman. We launched aircraft to the scene. It was February, so the waters were very cold and the people began abandoning ship, some of them succumbing to hypothermia, which, again, he was communicating people abandoning ship. And so we knew how dire the situation was. the helicopter on scene was talking to us, and they were lowering the basket for the crew to get into the basket to be hoisted up to safety. But some of the crew members were just too weak to even climb into the basket. It was a very, very sad situation. So 31 of those 34 crew members passed away. And of course, as a young, impressionable teenager, I, cried and was very upset about it. But out of that tragedy came the rescue swimmer program that the Coast Guard created. And I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Guardian with Ashton Kutcher and Kevin Costner.
Kevin Costner, yep.
So that movie was not about this case that I worked, but it was about the Coast Guard rescue swimming program. And that came directly from the tragedy of this case. So one of the things I learned early on in my career, well, one, we had so many success stories after that. The Coast Guard actually had a great reputation of saving people if they were called within time, to be able to save. Some people wait to the last minute, and physically there's no way to get there in time, to save people. But there were a lot of great stories I had in the many years that followed of cases that were much more positive in their conclusion. But the fact that we responded so swiftly in creating this program, and these are like our Navy SEALs. I mean, they are just incredible people jumping into the water into 30-foot waves, to go help people get to safety. So that was just one of the many stories I have that I wanted to share. And it just, I had a wonderful career in that organization, and now celebrating almost 18 years in this organization. So the humanitarian element of that and the charitable element of what the PGA Tour does just really aligns with my beliefs in wanting to be a helper.
It's amazing how it gets in your blood, right? I mean, my dad did third grade in Germany and then graduated from high school in Montgomery, Alabama. So I get it.
Wow.
I totally get it.
What service?
Well, his dad was a pilot. He flew P-51 Mustangs and trained pilots in the Air Force, the Army Air Corps, and then the Air Force. So it's it's a family business. So
Wonderful.
I understand. All right, so let's get to golf. I could do we could do a podcast on that for an hour,
right.
but let's get to golf. So the first line of the resume, if you will, the notes that you sent me prior to us talking, literally is media credentials. You approve media credentials for the PGA Tour's championship management events, and you touched on this: the Players, the President's Cup, FedEx Cup playoffs, the former World Golf Championships, as well as train and assist the other tournament media directors. Would you call that the largest chunk of your time, or what takes up the most of your time?
Yeah, that definitely does. I do train the other tournament media directors because some of them only have one event that they work for us, for an entire year. So naturally, that's not something you dip your hands into every day. You're going to need a little more help along the way, understanding who the media are that are out covering, because I have the perspective of event to event. I know which media are going to all the events on the PGA Tour throughout the year. We actually do use our website for the Champions Tour also, and they have about 30 events. So, between the 40 or so events on the PGA Tour and 30 events on the Champions Tour, that's a lot of events that are managed by this one system. And so it gives us an opportunity to see who is attending our events. We have that historical information. And to manage, who gets access to go to the event. So that is the majority of my time between training and then researching new media that are coming in. So not only credentialing the people that are out there, our Associated Press writer, might cover 20 events a year. So we see him a lot. But then there's people like local media at the areas where the tournament's being played. They have their own newspaper, TV stations, radio stations. So all those folks come out. But, there's a lot of new folks. And this is one of the conversations I wanted to have to you. The trend is more freelancers out there. I talked about during the Great Recession, seeing some of the newspapers cut staff. Well, we're seeing that happening right now as there's talk of an upcoming recession. And, you see some of the tech companies already with mass layoffs and talk about, ESPN starting to get ready to cut. And you hate to hear that, but people are very resilient, and a lot of them start their own efforts into media. Now, someone like yourself has a background in media, and you're still actually working in many of those traditional spaces in addition to starting this.
Right.
But what I'm seeing is people who do not have any background in media starting a podcast or a blog. There's these tools out there that make it very easily, some, with no cost, no investment and capital on the forefront, to go ahead and create this outlet. And now I want to come on site and, sit next to all the other media members and be my own media outlet, which I don't want to disparage or discourage anyone. We obviously love all the media coverage that we can get. But being on site is a whole different thing than covering it remotely, which I will say most of the podcast blogs and other freelance type journalists do that remotely, unless like you're on assignment for a more traditional outlet. So I get a lot of interesting comments for people when I, go back to them and say, well, I can't accommodate a media credential, but, feel free to use all these assets that we're putting out there. That was one of the good things that actually came out of the pandemic for us, is we started putting a lot of information online because, at that time when we first started playing, we had to test like the staff that was on site, the players that were on site. So media were very few and far between that actually got to come on site. We had to put desks 6 feet apart. So there just wasn't the space to accommodate a lot of people. And at that point, we said, okay, what do we need to give people to keep this information flowing and to not hold back people that want to provide coverage, but just, won't be one of these few numbers that get on site. And our team did an amazing job with fulfilling on our media site, just all kinds. We were already putting media official notes at the end of each round and stats from our ShotLink system and that kind of stuff. But we worked with our official photography partner to give away some free photos, which kudos to them for being willing to do that and help. But just all kinds of information. And we would have the press conferences, you could use Zoom or Microsoft Teams to sort of, dial in and participate. Obviously, you can't make it available to everybody. So that's where I really get where I'm very open to hearing the experts such as yourself, people who work in the organization. I talk to my boss a lot about this. Who are the people that really should be on site? We have smaller events, we have larger events. We now have these designated events that have a lot of star power, with our top players playing. With that kind of field strength, you have a lot of media that want to be there. So you've got sort of the owned media umbrella, which is our PGAtour.com, our social media, PGA Tour Live, which you do. Then we have our paid broadcast partners, Golf Channel, CBS, NBC, ESPN Plus, quite a few of our international partners that carry the broadcasts overseas. And then the free media, which is the big piece that I work with, Associated Press, the other wire services, local newspaper writer, photographer, TV stations, radio, the National Golf and Sports magazines and websites, Sports Illustrated, Golf Digest, Golf Week, all those folks. That's a big part of it. But then, like I said, there's this new piece where folks want to come in and it's like, okay, what I have to research what it is they're doing. And some of them have not done a whole lot yet. They're just starting, which, we prefer people to at least tell us what you're, show us what you're doing. Show us some golf coverage. Don't expect to come on site and be credentialed as a media member if you haven't really done much yet. And I guess one of the bigger things is, with startups, there's kind of a lack of editorial staff. I remember the days where we'd get calls about fact checking, the magazines would call us, hey, could you, check to see if this is right? We're getting ready to print this in our magazine. And just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of that type thing happening anymore. I actually see outlets with spelling errors and I'm like, ay,
Oh,
it's
yeah,
like,
absolutely. Yeah.
In one of your previous podcasts, you talk about the importance of the written word, really learning how to do copy and to write well, and all the press releases that my colleagues put out. And, the information that's out there, you want it to be something that's of, a quality professional nature, not something that people have to kind of scratch their head and figure out what you're trying to communicate.
The word that you used in our communications leading up to this was hobby. And I'm fascinated by that because the technology is such that anybody can call themselves a journalist. If you have an iPhone, you can shoot 4K HD video, you can record broadcast quality audio. And as long as you have access to the event, you can call yourself a journalist or a reporter. And this essentially is your job, as you just alluded to determine, is this person doing it for real or is this a hobby? And you talked about going into the background to kind of find out, all right, what else have they done? How do you do that? I mean, are you Google searching people's names? Like, how do you decide if someone is a legitimate media member or not?
That's a great question. And I wish I actually had more tools at my disposal, but I do Google them. I start there, and I actually look at their history in our website. The website was first created in 2006, the first generation. And then when I did the new one in 2017, we ported all that history over. So it's a tremendous amount of information in that website. I actually searched you and I saw your past history in there for when you were on site at different tournaments. And so I looked to see, was there a history here? Some people actually that have started a freelance operation back in 2010 might have worked for, such and such newspaper, a daily newspaper in a town where, and so there is coverage there. So I use whatever tools are at my disposal. So our website, certainly Google. If they don't show up in Google at all, when they register for an account for me to look at, I ask them to provide the URL. So I have access to whatever site they're claiming is their platform that they're going to, put their coverage on. So I look at that. The tricky thing with blogs and podcasts is there's really no way to show their audience reach. I mean, you probably have that on your end, but it doesn't come up in our PR tools. Like I could look up the New York Times and I could see exactly what their circulation is,
right.
By using those tools. But with a blog and podcast, you really don't have that. The best that I could do is look at a social media account that is associated with that. For instance, when I look at yours, I see you have a decent following. You have close to 5,000 followers on your Twitter account alone. And so that gives me confidence that, okay, there are people actually listening to this podcast because I can see via your social media where you're distributing the podcast that there's a lot of potential for eyeballs there. Or ears rather for the podcast audio. So, you want to make sure if you're bringing someone on site that they have an audience, that it's not just something that they're starting on their own. I mean, I literally have had people with 73 followers asked to come on site. And I'm just like, I don't think those expectations are realistic.
It is kind of a tightrope in that, for example, someone like the No Laying Up guys on Twitter have over 100,000 followers, and people watch their videos like it's their job, right? Colt Knost, who works for CBS, has an incredibly popular podcast that gets a lot of listeners. And so you got those that are established, but you might have the next one, just, someone with 73 followers, as you say, might have 10,000 by next year. And if you grant that person access, you're opening yourself up to a whole new audience. And that's got to be, I would imagine, a difficult judgment call to decide, I think this person is going to get there. Maybe they're not there yet. And to your point, there's also the question of space at the tournament. Being on site as opposed to being a remote broadcaster or covering it remotely it's a very big difference. Parking, credentials, a spot at media dining, like things that seem kind of trite or small are actually sort of important when you're talking about putting people in the building or putting people on site. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, absolutely. You hit on those exact points that are what I deal with. My PR colleagues, they don't want to say no to anybody. It's public relations. We want everybody and everybody that wants to be there. But it is a numbers game at the end of the day. And so it's finding that right mix of media to have on site that best promote our tournaments, but also helps the people that are in this business because they get more followers, when they cover something, and especially when they come on site. So I really get why they want to do that. And we want to have as many people as we can fit on site. But, obviously you can't overload it. There are only so many parking spaces and so many workspaces to fit people on site. And we give media broad access to our players. I think if you look at the other sports, NFL, NBA, I have not worked in those sports, but in talking with them and dealing with people and we actually hire a lot of people that work with other sports organizations. And so I try to pick their brain and, we give far more access. I mean, we have 4 days of professional golf on the PGA Tour. So after each round, those leaders come in. We have 2 days early in the week where we bring them in for pre-tournament press
I was going to say, yeah,
conferences.
plus Tuesday and Wednesday in the
Yeah, so
pro-am, right?
there's a whole lot of access that we provide. Well, if I start putting people in front of players that have no experience, they don't know, professionalism, etiquette, they don't know the right questions to ask, it really is embarrassing for our organization. So it's my job to kind of have that not happen and to put people in front of our players that have a sense of professionalism and propriety and understand the game and how it works and can ask intelligent questions and follow up with good written copy based on the interviews that they're having and participating in. So that's important too. You mentioned the no laying ups and, even Barstool and those folks that did start out as podcasts and are really much more than that. They are media companies. Now I recognize them as such because of their large following, for one. So audience reach is always an important thing to us. But number two, and this is one thing, in talking to my boss about this, how do we distinguish the people that we bring on site and we don't? And he talked about, hey, do our players recognize this forum? Do they participate in the podcasts? And that's really important because the no laying ups and the barstools, those folks, they do. And there are many others. I don't mean to use them only, but they do have very large followings. And in the beginning, it was kind of like, your brand represents one thing, and they were very kind of progressive and out there on some things that maybe didn't align quite right away with our brand. And, there are media regs. There's a 6-page document that a lot of people don't like to read, but, I'm pretty bold on, hey, especially probably from my military background, but rules are made to be followed. And really, they protect our partners too. We have partners in spaces and we own, some content in our own space, and we need to protect that. We actually give, I think, really a wide range of play for people to explore and write and do a lot within those regulations. But I wouldn't expect to go to a facility and not abide by their rules. I mean, if they're inviting me out and they're feeding me and providing me access to players and workspace to do my job, I should follow the rules. And so there was a little bit of that. But, things are actually working out quite well. Sometimes you have a little back and forth before you learn how to work with someone in a better space. And I think we're in that good space now with a lot of people. We certainly want to continue that positive rapport. So I don't want to discourage anyone when I tell them that they can't have a media credential. And it's certainly not a permanent, you can't have it. I try to encourage them to cover maybe some of our other tours, Corn Ferry Tour, Champions Tour. Do some work there, build your following, use what we have online that we give away for free. So many people are covering. I mean, we have far more people that cover remotely that we're able to have on site. So I do try to be an encourager if I see any kind of legitimate coverage and just a small following. We definitely want those people to grow and come back and cover our events.
Now I'm thinking as you're speaking about players on the PGA Tour who have started their own media ventures. Max Homa had a podcast with Shane Bacon for a long time before he ever won on the PGA Tour and became even more of a social media star than he already is. And
Mm-hmm.
you see a lot of players that are sort of branching out on their own. Do you have interaction with players from the media side? I mean, how does that work? Like if you've got a player that has a podcast or a radio show and wants to do something on site, are they treated differently than a regular member of the media?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, we are a player organization. So the things that our players want to do, we want to support it as long as it's in line with our rules and regulations. Obviously, if it's commercial elements, we have to look a little closely at that because, editorial coverage is non-commercial in nature. Now, of course, everyone has advertising and things that help them to pay the bills, but we have rules about that because you might have conflicts of interest and things like that. So there are a lot of things to consider. But whenever our players want to do something, we always want to be listening and supporting that as best as we can. We actually started a new branch of our player relations department called Player Promotions. And so that team helps them get additional sponsorships and things like that where we can help in that effort. So yeah, we want to continue to help in that way.
The logistics of an individual golf tournament largely fall on to the local organizing committee of the tournament itself. But I see that this is also a part of your position, talking about credentials, workspace, telecoms, transcripts, the audio visual, shot link. We talked about dining and parking and shuttles and things like that.
Yes.
That's an enormous job. I mean, I've been doing this for 13 years, and the first question I always have before I go to an event is parking and credentials. Those are the two important ones. And then after that, you get to the event, and you got to learn your way around the property. How much time do you spend on that? How much of that is truly relegated to the tournament itself, the local people who are on site, and how much of that falls on your desk?
Well, they are definitely the nuts and bolts to getting it done, but there is a lot of collaboration in advance for each tournament. So, for instance, Players Championship is early March. I start working on that in January when we come back from our holiday break.
That's an enormous event.
Yes,
Enormous event.
yeah, a couple of months. It's because we have so many people that come to that event. So the credentialing process is open much longer than for other events. And for that one, we're actually lucky because we have a permanent building. That's more of a rarity. So many of our events put up, large tents
Yep.
to house their media centers. So then it's like, okay, what size tent do we need? I do all the seating arrangements. So I tell them how to configure the desks and which ones need to have hard lines because someone's uploading a whole bunch of data, maybe to another country even. We kind of stopped having a lot of radio broadcasts within the media centers. Post pandemic, we started bringing players a lot of times for their pre-tournament interviews within the media center. So then a broadcast that often doesn't have like complete enclosure kind of disrupts that process. And honestly, when you have a lot of writers writing on deadline, you have to be, courteous to that. So some of the local radio stations that want to broadcast will have them broadcast outside on the, deck of a hospitality tent or, something of that nature to sort of accommodate them a little bit more. But yes, there's stenographers that transcribe every single player press conference that we do. That's part of our media website and offering to others who, whether they're on site or not, can download that information and take advantage of that as part of their coverage. The projection of the score, what's happening on site. If you have a media center that houses 150 or 200 people, you need to have a large screen up front, which we often do, big LED board where they can follow play. We also have individual ShopLink laptops so that, if I'm a reporter and I want to look at some stats, I can pull that up while I'm still typing, my notes. Yeah, parking. We try to get parking as close as we can. We don't want it to be terribly inconvenient for someone to be on a shuttle bus for 30 minutes. So that's something I work really closely with the tournament teams on. Our operations teams at these tournaments and tournament service managers are just amazing. I mean, the hours that they work to do what they do to get everything just right. And they're very open to, our input on all these things because, they want the best foot forward for media coverage for their events as well. So, yeah, it's very much hand in hand. I don't necessarily pick all the menus for media dining. I don't necessarily always get to that level, although
Right.
sometimes if the food's not very good, we may want to have a little more input. But, how that facility is it inside? Is it outside? During the pandemic, we had everything kind of grab and go. You walk up to a counter, you grab your food instead of having like an inside dining facility where everyone was sitting next to each other. But, just getting that footprint right is really important. I like to think of myself as being very efficiency minded. And just, hey, if I was traveling, which I do when I cover these tournaments, the hotel I stay at, how far I am from the site and how easy everything is from registration when I go to pick up my credential. Again, it's just a small part of the whole picture, but it's an important part, I think, especially for those who travel a whole lot. You just want to make life easy for them so they're in a good mood.
The marquee events that the PGA Tour has direct hands on include the ones that we touched on, the Players, the President's Cup, the FedEx Cup playoffs. How much work do you do? How much collaboration do you do with major events that are not under the PGA Tour's direct purview? And here I'm thinking about the US Open, the Masters, the PGA Championship, et cetera. Is that a busy week for you as a PGA Tour staff member?
It's actually not. A lot of people actually take vacation during those weeks because we have tournaments, all year long, and we don't have a whole lot of break. And as you've mentioned, those are run by other organizations. I will say, especially starting during the pandemic, we have been collaborating more closely and sharing ideas with those other organizations. I've always been very open. When I've had emails from other people, hey, have you heard of this media member? Because recognizing I have more history as far as, all year long, I am credentialing some of these folks. And those other organizations have, more than one major event, like the US Open, the Women's Open, and that kind of thing, Senior Open. However, it's a small number overall. They're very large events, but they don't see people as often as we see them week in and week out. And we love hearing from them the things that they're doing because they're doing it on the biggest stage. So again, having that back and forth and sharing information has been very helpful. I feel like we've done that more because, just months after the pandemic just threw us in a loop and canceled all our tournaments, we were back at it. We found a way to get people out there. Kudos to all those people that were involved in that process. And so, of course, we want to share that with other people who are also putting on golf events and what we've learned and what we can help them as a step forward. So that's a wonderful thing. But during the week itself, no, I really don't have any involvement. We send media officials to do their job just like they do their job at all of our events. But
right.
It's just not as prominent of a position. It's just continuing those notes, the stats, what's happening with the competition. So we continue to share with our constituents, all the people on our media list that receive that information. We don't want to stop that flow. We want to still have a presence and be there. And we do have some of our own efforts that happen on those weeks as well. And the media officials and rules officials are there to take part in that.
In looking at all of the structural changes to the PGA Tour that have been announced in the last 6 months, between designated events and PGA Tour University giving college seniors a path to the PGA Tour Latino America and Canada being merged into PGA Tour Americas, which I think is a great idea. As a broadcaster, it's been kind of hard to keep up, with all of these changes. And the Q School is back, and Corn Ferry Tour is offering fewer cards than previous years, and the Corn Ferry Tour finals are gone. And it's, as a broadcaster, you're kind of scrambling to keep up. In your situation, I would imagine people are coming to you and asking questions about these events. How difficult has it been for you to keep up internally with all of the changes?
That's an interesting question because I find it hard too. I work here in the building, and yet you'll find this funny. I follow on Twitter. The only reason I created a Twitter account was to follow the golf writers and to know what they're saying and they break news. And honestly, I hear some things from them before I hear it internally because I'm not in all these meetings that go on in the building, nor do I need to be. I'm busy doing hands-on work with other things. So I feel it's my responsibility to keep up, even though as media relations, I really work more on the logistics and the credentialing side. I do share information only within my purview. So I don't try to answer questions about stats or other tours that I'm not as familiar with. I direct people to the right person to manage that. So that's kind of where I try to really stay up on things, is reading things that are happening. I mean, we have daily clippings of people who are writing things about our tournaments, and I do try to read as much as I can. And that's pretty time consuming. You try to speed read a little bit and just kind of get the nuts and bolts and do the crib notes of what's happening. But I think it's an important element to stay up to date on what's happening. Yeah, I love the PGA Tour America's idea. I think that's really cool how they've combined that into one tour. I don't manage credentials for those tours. They actually, because some of them are out of the country and some of them there's a language barrier, they actually have people, at those local sites, or in the case of Canada, PGA Tour Canada obviously will manage a lot of that stuff. So the Corn Ferry Tour, kind of same thing. We have a couple of media officials that sort of work with the host organizations to manage that, because they really don't have like a huge number of people coming. That may change. I know the media officials are working to get more people there, and doing a great job at it, by the way. But the PGA Tour events obviously are the biggest. They're the ones that most people want to come to. But I think there's really a lot to be said for kind of cutting your teeth for new outlets on those other events and really kind of seeing how they work. And there's just more space is, the honest answer to that. It's like they're able to accommodate you a little better. So if you really want to cover sports and golf in particular, go cover these events and see how they're run first.
Last topic. What are the biggest challenges you face in your role, and what do you enjoy the most about what you do?
Well, the biggest challenge is saying no to media, that they can't come on site. And I've tried to find a way, because it's more and more. I mean, wow, I'm just probably getting double the number of requests that I used to get a year ago. So it's really exciting that this many people are interested in following golf and want to report on it. Some of that has to do with, the whole gambling part, the gaming, that whole storyline has sort of taken off with more states approving that type of activity on site, and just more people wanting to be involved in the editorial coverage of making projections and those kinds of things. And, we want to support that now as we've stepped up a gaming department too. So you have people covering the competition, some people covering specific players, like this is my hometown news, or alumni from a college that this player went to. You have business storylines, gaming, as I talked about, lifestyle with fashion and foodies and all these other elements, concerts that are happening on site. So as we've increased our storylines, more people want to come on site. And again, I don't want to disparage people, but there is only so much room for people to come on site. My biggest challenge is saying no to people. I just, I want to be an encourager. I want to help people do their job. So that I continue to try to find ways to encourage them to keep at what they're doing, grow their audience, until we're able to bring them on site at a PGA Tour event. And so what do I like the most? I love working with the people that I work with. They are just super talented. It's impressive to watch things come to light and happen. I'm not so much on the storytelling side. I'm on the support side of that. Okay, you're going to go on site and you're going to do these social media, or, you're going to do this shoot, and you need to have resources to do your job. So I like being the person that supports those evolutions. But it's just really nice to work with people that you enjoy being with. You're on the road, you go out to dinner together, and you spend a lot of time together in the office. And so, yeah, I like that part of it.
In just a few seconds, we'll have some closing thoughts on this episode, so stay tuned. If you're enjoying it so far, please consider subscribing or sharing and leave a review. Let me know what you'd like to hear in the future on Media Credentials. In honor of Tracey Veal's years in the Coast Guard, a couple of loose lines I need to get squared away. First, I misspoke during the interview. My paternal grandfather did not, in fact, fly the P-51 Mustang. He flew the P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine aircraft as opposed to the single-engine and much faster P-51. My maternal grandfather flew the B-25 Mitchell, the bomber that was made famous by the Doolittle raid over Japan after Pearl Harbor. Also, on the topic of new media, I used the No Laying Up podcast and website as an example. It turns out I severely undercounted their Twitter followers. I said over 100,000. Yeah, it's well over. At last check, it's actually 428,000. My bad, fellas. Carry on. Tracey mentioned Barstool Sports. Their main account on Twitter has 5 million followers. For comparison, the PGA Tour itself has 2.8 million. The conversation about new media and what is media is one that grows more important as the technology gets better and more small podcasts and blogs become large media outlets like Barstool, like No Laying Up. It's heartening to know that the tour's media relations manager recognizes that and uses resources like social media to keep up with the trends. Given Tracey's military history, it's not surprising that she would excel in this role. There's a level of selflessness required, plus a commitment to teamwork and discipline. And as she put it, a fondness for following the rules. Whether it's the golf media or the players on the PGA Tour themselves, Tracey's commitment is to service, as befits someone who served. Thanks again for listening to Media Credentials. For examples of my work, including video and audio clips, a blog, and my contact page, check out whitwatson.com.